Okay, Professor Giordano, if you wanted to start screen sharing, we'll be able to see you in a moment. There we go. We've got you.
There you go. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Beautifully.
Oh, wonderful. Well, thank you. And it's a real pleasure to be here. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. I'm sorry we all couldn't be there in person.
Yes.
COVID thing is really quite a drag. I'm sorry I couldn't stay for the whole day. I'm doing some work with the COVID task force, and unfortunately, it's become so labor intensive to change everything over to distance education. And so I apologize. I'm going to have to just depart after my talk, but certainly my email is available for all of you. Feel free to get in touch with me. I'll be happy to discourse with you, exchange ideas. Thank you very much. So of course, people always pay for your work, and this is a brief acknowledgement to demonstrate those individuals and those organizations who've been supporting my work through the years. And of course, the disclaimer is that everything that I'm about to say here reflects my opinion, certainly not the opinion of the U.S. Department of Defense, DARPA, the Naval War College, and/or those organizations and institutions that have supported and funded my work to date on this topic. So I come at it from a bit different perspective, although one that I think is certainly complementary to Mr. Scannell, Professor Huntington, and Schneiderman. The last points that were made speak to the issues of protection and privacy, and the relative ubiquity of the use of computational systems and data to be able to provide biometric information that's identifiable. Whether the data initially are anonymized, the potential for de-anonymization is huge. And really, we're seeing this more and more across the sciences. I think Professor Schneiderman's discussion of the ABCs, applied and basic conjoined, certainly represents the notion of applied integrative scientific convergence, where you're seeing not only the basic, and in my particular field, clinical sciences, but also the applications that go beyond the bench to the proverbial bedside, ever more to the boardroom and to the battlescape. The battlescape, I think, of the 21st century is not going to be the traditional Napoleonic or Clausewitzian battlescape, but one that really deals more with influence, deterrence, information, and manipulation. And so certainly one of the things that I've found as a neuroscientist for the past 4 decades is that the goal of neuroscience, writ both small and large, is to assess, access, and affect the brain. And in those ways, the implicit idea is to put the brain relatively at our fingertips, so to speak. And ever more, that's becoming a reality. If we look at progress in brain science, as we do with any science, and I think certainly this represents and reflects strongly Professor Schneiderman's long-going thesis, that there are tools that we use, the engineering and design components, and there are theories that we develop, which are the scientific elements, both in regard to basic science and its applications in a variety of fields of human endeavor. And there's a relative heuristic and/or technological, literally technological, where techne represents the tools and the techniques, and the logos represents a rational accounting of their use and the users who engage them, where we go tools to theory to tools. And certainly I've seen this in the brain sciences. The tools that were at my disposal, for example, 40 years ago, provided us with the capability to engage particular theoretical constructs of the way brains work, embodied in organisms that are embedded in their ecologies. And because of those levels of understanding and a very strong need to both validate, verify, and/or falsify those data, we then move theories to tools, where the tools get ever more capabilized and ever more sophisticated. And so what we see is that advances in neuroscience are becoming increasingly translationally viable, where we're now seeing the relative, both explicit and implicit success of neuroscience, not just as neuroscience per se, but as neuroscience and neuroengineering. The acronym we use is Neuro, S and T. And if we really think about the way we use computational science, and even the way we use something like AI, certainly, as Professor Huntington had alluded to earlier, the combination of vast amounts of data coupled with decisional technologies that are viable and highly capable of providing intelligent dissemination, assimilation, synthesis, and correlation of those data, create realistically a viable process pool. So advances in neuroscience and technology have been relatively linearized over the past 30 years, and certainly ever more over the past 15 years through the use of big data and computational systems, inclusive of those that utilize some form of decision technology and/or AI. What this has allowed us to do is to create the types of biometrics on a variety of scales that were spoken to earlier. It allows us to have anatomical and physiological correlation, It allows us to have some definition, description, and perhaps prediction of individual trajectories of expression, of identity, function, process, and activity. And it also allows some extent to be able to use those data to assess individual similarity and distinctions, and therefore assess individual group and populational variation, and perhaps predispositional assessment. In other words, if we talk about what was being used earlier, if we take the example, the analysis that were provided by Professor Schneider and Huntington, we say, all right, let's just say we have a clone Katina Michael. How can we predict and or define what the relative activities of the cloned Katina will be versus the real Katina, given that the cloned individual is not going to pop out as an adult, but rather will be a prenate, a neonate, a child, an adolescent, and then a young adult to adulthood Katina. So there's some relative perpetuity in the identity Katina Michael. The question is, how can we then model that individual's neurological systems so as to be able to either have some type of close identification and similarity of the real Katina's cognitions, emotions, and therefore behaviors in a variety of ecologies, or the anti-Katina, sort of the light and dark, the Janusian Katina. So what we're really seeing is the use of neuroscientific data as biometric data. This approach to integrative scientific convergence, as we've seen earlier, naturally conjoins the sciences, across the sciences, natural life and physical sciences, with biotech, engineering, and design. But of course, these are human enterprises that are engaged and used in the human sphere. So it has to appreciate the anthropological and social sciences, as we discussed earlier, to approach ethical, legal, and social issues, cultural diversity, cultural similarity, the idea that there may be political agenda and certainly political use of these very, very powerful tools. And what this then allows us to do is focus brain sciences on the assessment, access, and manipulation of neural structures and the things that they do. Cognition, emotions, and behaviors, and each and all of this is being potentialized, capabilized by computational systems and big data. In fact, that was an explicit point of the BRAIN initiative here in the United States. That's the Brain Research to Advancing Innovative Neurotechnologies initiative, launched in 2013 by then President Barack Obama, to be able to make sure that the National Science Foundations were remaining apace with the initial investments of DARPA and the National Institutes of Health, so that there would in fact be a big data resource and repository capable of doing the level of collection, accumulation, in some cases provenance, in some cases custodianship, and certainly synthesis and correlation of the levels and scale of data that range from the subcellular all the way to the social neurosciences. And this is critical, this is important, because we're not alone in doing that. As both of my colleagues, and certainly earlier in the day, unfortunately, I didn't have an opportunity to hear Pat Scannell's talk, but certainly what we've heard was that there is a global effect here, and I'll allude to that a bit earlier and speak to it more later and speak to it more directly. And the issue is that the United States is hardly alone in these pursuits. We know that the Human Brain Project of the EU, that I had the honor and pleasure of serving on for a couple of years, equally has a big data process and project. We know that China Brain Project is specifically dedicated to creating large-scale databases and harnessing databases globally, and the other large-scale brain initiatives, not only as standalones, but working with other forms of big science initiatives, are pouring literally billions of local national currencies into the assimilative conjoinment of big data and the biosciences, and specifically the neurosciences. Well, what does this allow us to do? Well, if you take a look at the little diagram in the right-hand corner, it essentially speaks directly to the issues that both of my colleagues earlier in their previous discussions had alluded to. The idea that it meets certain healthcare challenges by being able to develop some form, at least putative, solutions. It is posh in practice. It meets the need for large volume data banks. It meets needs for individual cohort and populational data tiering. It has intra and inter-tiering integrative potential. Certainly, it meets a requirement for longitudinal data input and real-time assessment, and it can be non-anonymized. So in other words, we can anonymize the data going in and put in a number of checks in the block. I mean, understand that I wear two hats. I wear a hat not only as a bioscientist, but also as an ethicist. And one of the things that keeps coming up over and over again, how protected are my data? Well, we have relative assurances, relative assurances at this point that data are going to be used for the intention in which they are originally directed. But as you heard earlier, once those data are out there, so to speak, they're not just relegated to medical informational data banks and repositories. No, these things are like cat out of the bag. Once they're out of the bag, yeah, we want to take the kitty out of the bag because it's cute and it's furry and it purrs and it sits in our lap. But we also have to recognize that the cat has claws and teeth and pees and poops. And that can be a rather dangerous animal, and it's very difficult to get the cat back in the bag and to herd the cats. So what we're looking for are not only data that can be anonymized with regard to certain research practices and the relative anonymity that goes along with large-scale data repositories, but for this stuff to be useful. In other words, for some form of neurocognitive biometrics to be useful either in the clinic or in the marketplace, so to speak. And here I'm speaking about the polis, I'm speaking about agoras, out there in public, it's a variety of uses that range everything from the protective to the commercial. These things will need to be de-anonymized. And they will need to be cross-linked with other forms of data. At present, what we call neurocyber or neurobig data approaches are aimed at essentially these four goals. And they're achieving them ever more regularly. They're achieving maximized storage potential and retrieval, the capacity for parallel computing. There is the aim to make them scalable and customizable. And this last point is of particular importance to our discussions this morning and those for this afternoon. They're accessible and shareable. The slide that I have illustrated there for you gives you a graphic of brain visualization and how we can actually use that in terms of information, education, and health. Increasingly, what we'll find is that big data and brain-based robotics and prosthetics are going to be accessible from portable brain-machine interfaces, and increasingly the trend here is to utilize multiple forms of biosensors that are both donnable and doffable as well as implantable. And I recommend all of you to go to the DARPA website, www.darpa.mil, and look up N as in November cubed, the number 3. Full transparency, I serve as one of the neuroethicists on that project as part of the BRAIN Initiative, and N3 is the non-neurosurgical novel neuromodulation project. The idea here is to be able to create brain-machine interfacing that both reads from the living brain and is capable of writing into the living brain in real time remotely, and utilizing those data as part of a large-scale vast array network to be able to then acquire, employ, and in some cases affect the data sources themselves. And now here we're talking about everything from cells to individuals, perhaps to societies. Yeah, the implication there is, quote, mind reading and, quote, mind control. But realistically, it represents the contemporary trajectory based upon the technological capability that we'd see with any form of biometrics. This form of data acquisition and tracking, which our group a number of years ago had referred to in a series of white papers as TITAN, T-I-T-A-N, Tiered Integrative Tag and Analyses Networks, allows the acquisition of multi-scalar, multi-level, multi-typological data and tracking, and increasingly utilization across domains, cellular to the social, across levels from the individual to the populational, across geographic locales, so that there in fact could be complete geospatial access, which is axiomatically one of the intents of neurocyber big data, across time, as I'll show you in a moment, and across groups, both comparatively, in what's called upward comparisons, and normatively, which are then referred to as downward comparisons. If we take a look at what these would look like with individual data, Professor Huntington's comment was absolutely correct. There is indeed ongoing discussion as to the importance, value, if not need, to have a viable data repository and real-time biosensing information from birth to grave. And the reason for that is that the purloinability of individuals' data, given the repositories and resources that we've used to date, for example, passports, IDs, etc., require a far greater level of granularity than simply my picture on my driver's license or my passport. Oh yeah, a chip on my license is great, And an electro-identifiable passport is wonderful if and when we ever get allowed to travel internationally again, so I can just scan it rather than going through customs. But ultimately, it's going to come down to the identity of who I am, what I am biologically, and then how that relates both to my history as well as to certain definitive elements of my present that then may be in some way descriptive, if not predictive, of my near future. So what we're able to do is take lifespan data, aggregate lifespan data, in what's called time span data, and through the analysis, correlation, and in some cases predictive algorithmic approaches to lifespan and time span data, be able to aggregate point data so that at that point you have vast amount of integrative data that are able to say at this particular point in time we can de-anonymize that data for this particular person, and that gives us particular inferences, descriptions, and in some cases predictive domains about their cognitions, emotions, and perhaps behaviors. This is exactly the explicit intent of neurobig data. Now, if we take these data from an individual across the lifespan, and we use these as part of a larger scale whole world repository, or even populational repository, whatever population you decide, however large an N that may be, we then see this, which is sometimes referred to as the correlation code. We're taking individual data here, either across a lifespan to be able to get time span data, where each one of those clades represents a point in time previously. And this allows us point data, which can then be correlated to those prior data that then allow us to make particular predictive influences. So life and time span data can then be compared to other individuals' lifespan and time data. That's called cohort data analyses. And ultimately, various cohorts can then be compared to a population or populations. If you will, take a look at the top of that cone and picture that curve across the top of that cone to represent a quasi-Gaussian distribution of some form and of some pattern with some particular parameters. That Gaussian distribution can then be used in a downward fashion to gain normative influence in terms of what is a norm and what is an abnorm across a range of potential effects, once again, that go from the cellular, functional, pathophysiologic to the socio-pathological and or socially normative. And of course, there's great power that goes along with doing that, because those data can then be used either in real time or asynchronously to make particular inferences about what this then means towards the regard and treatment of those individuals. Earlier, in the talks that we heard this morning from both Professor Schneiderman and Huntington, the idea that data do not exist as standalones, but they rather are part of a larger nodographic array, is seen here. This is what our group had developed a number of years ago. This is what we refer to as a von Mueller nodogram. Consider each one of these nodes, the actual circles, not to be 1 or 2 dimensional, but rather 3-dimensional, and capable of altering the dimensions of their circularity. So in other words, if each one of these represents a domain or a dimension, as various factors become relevant within this domain and dimension, the area of nodal interaction becomes greater or lesser. So the edge components, where the nodes interact with the lines or the edges, changes. Let me give you an example. If we're changing particular genotypes, both within an individual and or a genomic population, those genotypes may differentially affect each other. So populational genomics and individual genomics may affect genetics. We spoke earlier about DNA typing and or genetic typing of individuals. And such things may then be correlated to changes in phenotype or anatomy, which can then also be correlated to, for example, chemical or other forms of physical biomarkers that can be correlated to functional imaging, either directly by functional imaging, or a repository of functional imaging which then allows correlation of anatomical and chemical changes to what nodes and networks in the brain may be active based upon individual to group and group to individual comparators. This is exactly how functional imaging works. These can then be linked to behavior, either in real time via excessive monitoring through the use of a variety of scalar monitors, for example, the indwelling biomonitor, to a whole host of cameras and other forms of monitoring such as credit card use, travel, social dynamics, media, etc. The example was brought up earlier that it may very well be through the use of big data, people may find out that you're COVID-19 positive before you even know that you're COVID-19 positive. I like to tell the story of a colleague of mine a couple of years ago who suddenly started receiving a whole bunch of pings on Amazon for baby clothing and toys. Had no idea what was going on until he found out that his wife was pregnant. That information was essentially forwarded from a medical provider to the insurance company, and the insurance company let that out. Next thing you know, Amazon is soliciting them with a whole host of baby products. Thanks for the good news. Talk about a spoiler alert. Well, the idea is to do this in the brain sciences. A few years ago, we wrote a paper called Deliver Us from Evil, on the possibilities and problems of using assessment neurotechnologies in public safety. And you can see how this might come into play. The definitive, the descriptive, perhaps the predictive capability of the brain sciences, again, not used alone, but when used in a non-dispositive way with other forms of data integration, create a fairly valid picture of how things might function from the level of literally impulse to engagement and articulation. And in part, that's the point. So one of the things that we're looking to do is to integrate the black box approach. I mean, clearly, we understand the need for privacy, and many of these large-scale big data engines, and here I'm speaking specifically about the one that I know best, which is referred to as the ATRA system, or as it's used at Georgetown, the Aves Terra system, employs a black box approach. So in other words, organizations, and these can be literal organizations as in institutions, or they can be data network organizations that are accumulating and repository support data, have the data pulsed into a black box big data engine that then creates patterns and correlations, which can then be released back to either the organizations if they're institutional, or can then be matched to organizational pairing to create some viable correlative pattern of not only what is, but what was. So in other words, linking past to present, and then in past to present, creating viable algorithms that can then be realized in real time to make certain predictions and descriptions about the future. Well, that's great if it all goes in the black box. And the relative security of the ATRA system, originally developed in conjunction with DARPA, and the Aves Terra system, which we developed by Accreta, allows viable black box use and the potential for need-to-know de-anonymization. However, the fact that these systems are functional and viable in light of their de-anonymization, that I can use these data for personal reference, becomes critically important to their value and viability, which then also opens a Pandora's box, literally. Recall, if you will, the myth of Pandora. Pandora had a wonderful box of charms, and she was cautioned in opening that box because that box could contain both goodies and or gremlins. And in opening that box, she let both the goodies and the gremlins out. So the idea here is, look at the Pandora's box being borne upon the shoulders of here our intrepid peregrine traveler. As we're moving towards a large-scale, multinational, global data repository in the brain sciences by intent, by explication and design, yeah, we have this box with all the goodies in it, and we're dying to open the box because that will potentialize and capitalize what the brain sciences are doing, not only clinically, but publicly, politically, militarily, and of course the goal here is to use this in ways that are safe, secure, and sound for public safety. And I put public safety in quotes, be they scare quotes, or be they de-scare quotes based upon your emotional representation of what I'm talking about. But the caveats are as follows. If data is accessible, they are accessible. If data are taggable, they're targetable. And given the fact that we're using hierarchical data, as we've seen here, 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 and here, the issue becomes not necessarily if each one of these nodes per se are secure, but if the edge networks that capabilize the intranodal interactions are secure. And the answer to that question to date has been no. For those of you who may have seen me in person, who know me in the flesh, you realize I'm a bit vertically challenged. I stand a whopping 66 inches. I spent most of my adult career as a wrestler and judo player. And I can tell you, as a wrestler and judo player, one does not have to be 6'5". Realistically, one can be 5'6". And if you want to hit people at their weak points, you don't hit them where they're strong, you hit them at the joints. And in this case, if it's stackable, it's hackable. And what's hackable is manipulable, and what's manipulable and controllable is corruptible. And this then brings us into the possibility, if not real probability, of utilizing neurocyberscience and technology as a weapon. Let me provide for you, if I can, the standard Oxford Dictionary definition of a weapon. It isn't necessarily the colloquial thing that we think about hitting somebody over the head with a stick. It is literally means of contending against others. Obviously, going along with that is the more colloquial use of something that can be used to injure, defeat, or destroy. But when I teach about weaponology and when I teach about bioweapons and chemoweapons and techno-weapons, I think it becomes very important to understand that the goal may not necessarily be high morbidity and or mortality, but rather influence and deterrence. And I like to allude to these sort of old film noirs of 1930s, 40s, and early 50s. I mean, picture the two detectives sitting in this smoky bar, and across the room, there's a beautiful woman sitting at the bar, and she sort of hikes her dress up a little bit and shows some leg. And one detective says to the other, "Ah, that dame's gams are a weapon," which translates into that woman's legs are a weapon. Well, she's not going to hit the detectives over the head with them or crush their faces between her knees. No, what they're saying is that those legs are influential. Those legs can deter their desire to leave the bar and go back to work. They want to stay there a little more, maybe buy her a drink, just enjoy the view, so to speak. You've seen those movies. But if we put these two things together, what a weapon really becomes is an agent that mitigates aggression or fosters thoughts and feelings of affiliation. In other words, it's an influence device, or it incurs burdens of morbidity that need not necessarily be physical. These are biopsychosocial burdens of morbidity, disability, or suffering, and in this way neutralizes or directs or deters a potential opponent's activities, cognitions, behaviors, or in fact one that induces mortality. Which then brings us squarely into the idea of weaponizing neurocyberscience and technology. Here, we can see the effects are both tactical and strategic. The effects are proximal, and they're very tactical, and now we're talking about the accessibility and use or misuse of data. Our group is spending a lot of time trying to determine if and how neurocyber informatics can be used to then gain information that ranges from the genotype to the phenotype to be able to assess individual, group, and populational weaknesses and vulnerabilities to develop precision pathologies. Clearly, given the ongoing contemporary crisis, there has been talk that COVID-19 may be a bioweapon. It is not a bioweapon. I mean, I have no idea directly whether or not it was one of the investigative agents that had been studied or had been stockpiled or in some way was in the repository within the biocenter at Wuhan. But for all intents and purposes, as far as I know, certainly on the unclassified side, and there's nothing that came across the high side, at least in my portfolio, that would suggest directly that this is a bioweaponized agent. It seems to be a natural agent that represents a genome that is zoonotic, transferring from animals to humans. But let's just stop here for a moment. If in fact we can find information about individuals' phenotypes, genotypes, and as a consequence determine niches, if you will, or nicks, vulnerabilities in their immunological armor, in their phenotypic or genotypic susceptibility, the capacity to develop precision pathologies becomes overwhelmingly large. But we don't necessarily have to make bugs of that sort. We can make bugs much more of an informational sort. Now we're talking about data modification and how modifying one's data, in other words, as we spoke earlier, as Professor Huntington alluded to, if there is a Katina Michael out there, or a Guy Huntington, or a Jim Giordano out there, who says that they're me, and in fact they have biodata that indicates that they are me, well then, who am I? Am I the doppelganger, or are they the doppelganger? And how will we determine what doppelganger Heitschaft really is? And how will they be treated publicly? And then ultimately, by manipulating those data in an individual, what will be the economic impacts? Let's think of it like this. Let's just say that there was a Jim Giordano bio-doppelganger out there. And this person suddenly presented at Georgetown or showed up at the Pentagon or any of the other places where I have to present an ID. And for all intents and purposes, they're me. And then I show up and I say, no, I'm me. No, I'm not. That person is. Economically, that individual may begin to reap whatever benefits or burdens go along with my economic profile. Socially, that person might be treated as me. And of course, the issue here is, what does that then tell us with regard to biosecurity on the global scale? So we can view neurocyberscience and technology in ways that affect opposing elements, certainly, at least to one extent, as a weapon of mass destruction. In other words, developing precision pathologies that may be broad scale enough to be able to induce scalar epidemics, pandemics, and at this point, that might even sidestep the current biological toxins and chemical weapons convention. In other words, these pathologies simply do not exist. They're not on the registry of the criteria of those agents that are currently categorized by the BTWC. I'm making them anew. So the idea there is that the BTWC, the Biological Toxins and Weapons Convention, as Dan Gerstein and I have written about 2 years ago, might need to at least re-examine, if not revise, its procedures and how things are characterized. In other words, it may not necessarily be that we have to actually categorize key pathologies themselves, but rather particular methods in developing pathologies and sensors and bioinformatics and cyber that might now need to be part of the new focus of what these international weapons conventions address. But more likely is the non-kinetic use of neurocyberscience and technology as a weapon of mass disruption. Here, research, development, test, and evaluation is not necessarily bounded by the current constraints of the Biological Toxins and Weapons Convention. The use and misuse and manipulation of such information is highly effective, both non-kinetically and, as I would argue, perhaps kinetically, if indeed we redefine what kinetics are. They can be clandestine, covert, and non-attributable. Things just happen. Suddenly I manipulate your data, and I manipulate your data in such a way that it comes up on your medical records that you're diabetic. Next thing you know, you're getting insulin. You may not need insulin. And although that might be fairly overt, because what's ending up happening is the effects are going to be fairly rapid and certainly robust, manipulation of neuropsychiatric data are far more insidious. If in fact I insert certain things into your medical record that would then classify you as having a neuropsychiatric predisposition, premorbid condition, prodromal state of something like something along the schizophrenic spectrum, for example. This might affect your ability to function, to get a job, to get a security clearance, etc. And so this then incurs ripple effects in and across a variety of scales. And since we're talking about scales, let's please understand that the United States, Canada, our European allies, our Australian, New Zealand allies, Japanese allies, etc., are not the only countries that are devoted to efforts and enterprise in this space. Neuroscience and technology certainly, and the big data and artificial intelligence and decision technologies that are necessary to capabilize neuroscience and technology are a global enterprise. And of those enterprises, our trans-Pacific competitor, China, is explicitly leading the way. The expressed intent of Mo Ming-po, who's the director of the China Brain Project in 2015, is that by virtue of dedication of significant funding coming from the next series of 5-year plans, as well as the activity of a new Chinese organization called Weijiwei, which is essentially a DARPA mimetic organization that seeks to engage the development of high throughput, high risk, and highly effective technologies, primarily in the bioscience and bioengineering space, in 40 calendar months, will accelerate the progress of Chinese neuroscience and neurotechnology, inclusive of neurocyber, to such an extent that we're seeing about a 68% increase in research, development, test, and evaluation by 2025, about a 53% market share by 2025, and China is seeking to be the global hegemon, economically as well as scientifically and technologically, in the neuro S&T space, inclusive of neurocyber S&T, by 2030 to 2035. And China is not alone. Transatlantic strategic competitor Russia is certainly engaged, in some cases engaged with China to develop large-scale data networks, primarily for biometrics, with a particular emphasis on neurocognitive. There are ongoing efforts in Iran, in North Korea, and increasingly we're looking to the activities of virtual nations that are using virtual currencies to fund activities in this space, as well as the possibility for use of what's referred to as biohackers or public scientists that are either working directly or maybe working as nation-state proxies. And I think the issue is one that was alluded to earlier, and quite frankly, it's quite real. Lack of focus on, quote, our part certainly provides at least some opportunistic window for others to occupy the space in a way that creates relative hegemony, capability, and perhaps manipulability, control, dominance. So yeah, it's very, very important that we're teaching our people about science, technology, engineering, and maths. Yeah, absolutely. But understanding how science, technology, engineering, and maths are used, can be used, and perhaps should be used, utilized, surveilled, guided, and governed in the new global milieu of the 21st century is equally, if not more important. More than that, however, I think we need to understand that the momentum of progress that is being generated in the neurocyber S&T space is overwhelming, which then gives us these core questions and issues. And you know, I'd love to say to you I have answers, but I don't. I mean, certainly the answers are above my pay grade and larger than my relative sandbox, and it's going to take the conjoinment and collaboration of others, like we have here on this workshop, coupled with our respective institutions and not just governments, but whole of nation approaches, as I'll speak about in a moment, to address the question. What do we do with the information we have? What are we doing about the information and capability we don't? Given what could be done, what should be done, and how do we decide? We've advocated a relative preparedness process that I have identified for you here. I usually impugn anyone who directly reads a PowerPoint slide. You can read this on your own. But I think we really sort of take this to the point is that these things are summative. In other words, if we look at these, we can look at this as sort of a sigma function, or perhaps not just a sigma function, but really more kind of a non-linear function of exponential growth. So in other words, what we have to be able to do is plan a robust framework that remains sensitive, that remains available, that remains adaptive to changing environments and risks that are currently evolving, not only within the science and technological side, but within the societal side. And in that way, it becomes not just a sigma, but more of an integral function. The core premise is that there really needs to be far greater emphasis, development, acuity, and capability of neurocyber tools and methods. I advocate and beat the drum very, very strongly for a Neurological Information Non-Discrimination Act, a NINA Act, or NINA profile. This was originally advocated by Stephanie Kostyuk in 2012. At that time, Ms. Kostyuk was a law student at Vanderbilt, and she wrote a paper that was not highly accessed. I think it's actually one of the most brilliant papers I've ever read. It's actually a paper I wish I wrote. And clearly, I think what a NINA would do would provide at least some level of national capability to be able to assess and guide, if not govern, the way neurological information are utilized. Ms. Kostyuk's paper primarily addressed the occupational side, but clearly I think that can be expanded to a number of other spaces and domains, inclusive of things such as healthcare, social life, political life, etc. But I think more than that, it would provide something of a working model for what may be an international form of neurological information non-discrimination that then allows viability of certain types of surveillance at an increased level of neurobicybersecurity. I think there is a need for ongoing surveillance. There's certainly a need for discourse and dialogue, and as we're having here, a need for communication inclusive of public communication and some non-public communication. Let me stop at that for a moment. Please understand, let me be very transparent. I carry and have carried a security clearance. There are certain things that need to be transparent to the public in terms of intent, process, method, risks, and threats. However, I'm also a strong advocate in that I think it is foolish to show the opposing team or the competing team your playbook on Friday and expect to win the game on Saturday. There are certain things that must remain close hold. And as a consequence of that, I think there needs to be a much more detailed approach towards those things that have a higher security clearance with regard to neurobiocybersecurity. But over and above that, I think given the momentum in the field, not only nationally, but because of its internationalization and globality, demands not just a whole government approach that certainly my colleagues have discussed earlier, but please understand that both our transatlantic and our trans-Pacific strategic competitors are utilizing a whole-of-nation approach that in fact is advocated by and is upheld and sustained by a relatively seamless triple helix of government, academia, and the commercial legal enterprise. As such, the only way to compete against whole-of-nation approaches that are explicit and by intent in advancing science and technology is to develop an equivalent whole-of-nation approach to identify, characterize, counter, or prevent these emerging technologies that threaten and erode the United States and its allies' security and stability in this space. We've advocated a four-thrust strategy. The first is increasing awareness, bravo and brava to what we're doing here. Quantifying the actual risk and threat becomes important. So describing these things and talking about them, I think, become important. But the quantification of the threat then becomes important to identifying which represent priority risks and threats, and then how we should focus resources on countering those threats. The earlier simple discussion between Professor Schneiderman and Huntington, where Professor Schneiderman kind of chuckled and said, yeah, that's not a real answer to the question. Perhaps what we have to understand here is, well, how do we engage the POSH approach? How do we develop solutions based upon both the problem and the problem owner and developer? And in some cases, when you're dealing with this type of multinationality, the question then becomes, do we see that there are ethical systems in place that reflect long-standing cultural biases, needs, values, that we simply cannot change without risk of international imperialism? And as a consequence, what do you need to do to sort of play in that sandbox? And of course, understanding those threats, quantifying them, also then allows for that fourth thrust to then be articulated in preventing and delaying future adversary and competitive effectiveness. If you want to see what this would look like, basically this is not rocket science, it's not neurosurgery. This is simply what an articulated triple helix actually would manifest. Academic institutions, research centers, and intelligence community working for the first two thrusts that then seamlessly move into engagement of law enforcement, homeland security, national labs, and industry. Then as we move from thrust 2 to thrust 3 to thrust 4, then engage resources of the Department of Defense, Homeland Security, state, and the intelligence community. These are not discrete silos, but rather, as you can see by the top of that slide, represent correlative activities based upon relative capability to qualify and quantify threats and mobilize resources to surveil, in some cases to intervene against them. So in summary, let me go to the bottom of this. Let me go to the sort of bumper sticker first, that's your bottom line up front, and then read back through it. I think we're moving away from some of the more Napoleonic effects, some of the more Clausewitzian dynamics of the way conflict, engagement, non-kinetic activities, and perhaps warfare itself will be articulated. It's not going to be sort of massing large armies, but rather effective subtle influence on a variety of scales that then engage disruptive capability that create ripple effects across a variety of domains. The notion here, for Sun Tzu, is that the victorious warrior or competitor wins first and then engages war and competition, while defeated warriors go to war first and then seek to win. Neuro, cyber science and technology, informational technology, big data all provide means of gaining information about others. And as consistent with the Sun Tzuian type of philosophy, the competitor who knows both themselves as well as their competitors and adversaries well, knows them granularly, completely, characteristically has the viable tools of the weapons that are needed to win that war before the first shot is even fired. So what we see is that current neurocyber science and technology is growing exponentially. We've done risk assessment evaluations of both idiosyncratic as well as existential and multidimensional risk, and it is in fact a clear and present danger to the United States national security and stability as well as those of our related allies. Those identified risks and threats, inclusive of information about what represents vulnerabilities of key populations to dread threat that may prompt their relative vulnerabilities and volatilities not only to movement, migration, etc., but also perhaps violent, should prompt funded research into the technologies, innovations, and measures and solutions necessary to address the space. Remaining ahead, or at least a pace of competitors and adversaries' abilities to exploit these informational resources for influence and deterrence. And once again, let me bang this drum loudly and repetitively. It is sort of like voting in Chicago, do it early and often. A whole-of-nation approach, which is going to be essential to leverage all sections of national power and capability, given the fact that our competitors are, in fact, moving in those spaces with those resources. I've only had about a scant hour of your time. We've been working in this area for a while. I provide you with this additional information that looks at what we're doing. Certainly would look to join your collaboration. And if you look to contact me, that's where you can reach me. Please feel free anytime. I usually try to get back to folks within a day, but given our current crisis and the scramble to get things online, it might be a little bit longer. So I beg your pardon before I even reach out or have reached out from you, that I might be a little delayed in getting back to you, but I promise I will. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for your attention, and thank you very much for inviting me to present here today.
Thank you so much, Professor Giordano. I think you've made our brains explode. I'm going to ask Pat Scannell to now begin his presentation. I know, Jim, you may need to go offline. We'll let you do that seamlessly, but if you are able to stay for Pat's talk, you may get questions thereafter. Or would you like Pat perhaps to ask you the one and only question as you move on to the rest of your day? What would you like to do?
Unfortunately, I'm going to have to pull pitch because I have some other things I have to attend to. So if Pat wants to bop me with a question, that'd be great.
I got one for you, Jim. Every time I listen to you talk, I feel both smarter and dumber. Smarter for having heard you talk, and dumber compared to you.
You're a very kind man, Pat. I'll pay you after the conference. Thanks for saying that.
Thanks. You know, you've been talking about data, like people's data, and it's funny because when I look at data, I think that there is the kind of information that we sense that can be objectively captured. You know, body cams. You know, we can record the audio of my conversation and record what I see. Maybe even haptics somehow. There's meta. There's the ability to look at somebody and infer from their microfacial expressions or other attributes what's going on in their head. But Dennis McBride wrote a book called Quantifying Human Information Systems, and in it he talks about the processes inside the head are order of 6 to 8 times orders of magnitude self-referential. The ability to see something and then recall something and then think about something, that level of what goes on in someone's head, I assume that you're looking, when you talk about someone's data, that you're looking fairly broadly across all of these, not just what they observe, but what we observe about the person, what we meta-analyze and enrich about what we see about that person, and then eventually maybe even what's going on self-referentially within their quote thoughts based upon some of the darker stuff. Am I looking at, when you say personal data, am I looking at that too broadly? Am I looking at it too narrowly?
No, you're spot on. I know Dennis well. I mean, Dennis and I worked together. We were both at the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies a number of years ago. In fact, Dennis handed the reins of the Center for Neurotechnology Studies over to me as he went and pursued other options, bigger fish. Dennis is a good thinker. He's absolutely right. I mean, you know, one of the issues is that virtually all of the activity of a sentient organism is egoistic activity.
That's right.
Let me explain what I mean by that. I mean, so our consciousness and our representational cognition is what we call, it's in the sits range. It's subjective, it's intentional, and it's transparent only to oneself. Which means that the point of view phenomenon of the embodied organism is, how does this affect me? So even when I'm thinking about you, what I'm thinking of is about you and how you affect me. If nothing else, just the way thinking about you makes me feel. It's what the neuroscientist Antonio Damasio refers to as a feeling of what happens.
Right.
The ability to sense that, so in other words, it may not necessarily be thought reading per se. In other words, where I'm not able to get the actual thought, although, let's put that on the shelf for a moment. But the ability to sense a change in the internal dynamic state as a consequence of a particular representational pattern of brain activity is certainly one of the explicit intents, not only of the DARPA program, but of other programs. The fact that that could then be correlated via big data and artificially intelligent decision and correlational and or matrix design mechanisms would then be able to do the following. If I'm able to assess a particular physiological state in you, and I'm able to assess that particular physiological state is due to a representational pattern of brain network activity, and I can in some way access a repository of prior data from your brain that would then correlate it to key stimuli, either external or internal, what I would be able to do is to create a correlative map. That's called brain mapping by virtue of representational connectomics. So the issue there is I may not exactly know what you are thinking about, but I certainly would have an idea of what your thinking content might be, or context might be, and what you're feeling. The next part would be to actually specify that there's going to be representational kind of node network activity pattern when you're thinking about certain things. And we are precariously close to that, if I may. Some of the work that's coming out of neuroimaging, where they're now correlating the brain image itself to the evocative stimulus that was perceived, is certainly a step into the anteroom of that chamber. So I think what we're seeing is movement in that direction, and it really just depends on how explicit the intent is to move in those ways, with the goal being to then utilize those as an internal state representative, where we're now trying to get some access to subjectivity and not just objective fact.
And just to kind of dumb that down to my level, I mean, in the real world, we can be having ML against pattern recognition from traffic cameras prior to terrorist activities that does some type of gait analysis and that detects both what the bad actor did, because we know post hoc what they did because we actually saw the car blow up and we saw them trigger it, but we can also do analysis of other people around them, facial or gait or whatever. So this isn't hypothetical stuff. And then if you bring that to that kind of next level that you're talking about, there's such a rich body of information to work with here. Knowing who somebody is based on their face is just the tipping point of all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me just go back a slide here. So again, if you take a look at the first reference we cite there about mapping brain research for directions and dangers in dual use, we described that specifically. And if we take a look at the biodata risks in synth bio that appeared in J Bioterrorism Biodefense that I did with Diane Deulis and Chuck Lutz, we actually speak about those exact phenomenon, as well as the chapter we did for Jeff Coleman and Sean Matei's book. So what we're really looking at here is, yeah, just that. In other words, what we're able to do is we're able to match relative subjectivity to the capability of objective fact in terms of activities and behaviors. And the idea there then feeds back to the Giordano Kulkarni paper, which is Deliver Us from Evil, utilizing assessment neurotechnologies for public safety to do just that. If I can sense your subjective state and correlate that to past activities, I may be able to then define or predict intent, which then opens the door for what sounds like minority report. And then of course you get into the whole idea of how can you mitigate that, and then that opens sort of the further can of worms of the whole notion of neurocorrectives. So if I can sense it, can I then also modulate it, and what do we do with that? So yeah, the plot thickens. Great points all. Thanks.
Good stuff, Jim.